Yes, Vic, keep firing that one laser. You'll get him one of these years. 1985 saw Konami release Gradius to arcades, a horizontal space shooting game where you flew your Vic Viper thing through 7 varied worlds, shot things, avoid getting shot or crashing into things, collecting power-up pods to cycle through a power meter that lets you manually enable ship enhancements and then overcome the stage hazard before fighting the same generic boss whose weak point is always its core. And eventually it grazed a bunch of platforms, in Japan at least. Around these parts we got Gradius on the old Nintendo Entertainment System, and it was certainly a thing that happened. But we're not touching that version today. Instead we're looking at Gradius for PC Engine, released in 1991 by Konami, and never seeing a localized release on TurboGrafx-16. Which is a shame because it's actually a pretty solid port, even if it had to compete with Super Nintendo and its port of, let's see here, Gradius 3. Yep. Now for those who have never played Gradius, my condolences, but to reiterate for those who have not paid attention to the opening spiel, you flew your Vic Viper thing, you shot things that occasionally drop pods that cyclically lights up icons in your power meter, and by pressing the one button, whatever icon was lit up on the meter below was enabled, which could mean a speed boost, extra weapons like missiles, lasers, or double shots, a temporary shield that really doesn't last all that long, or the more useful feature, options that shadow your ship and fire the same weapons you have, and you could have up to 4 of these things trailing you, which makes for compelling firepower at your disposal, and perhaps even a bit of cockiness as you're blazing through these levels without a care in a galaxy, and then all of a sudden, whoops, and then you're back to your pea shooter and thus fairly boned, unless you could get a decent collection of power-ups up and running. Speaking of bones, Gradius on PC Engine has a new level with dinosaur bones in it. A nice nugget to throw at the PC Engine folks who had to endure a smaller field of vision. Yeah, Gradius has a thing where the levels that don't normally scroll up and down in PC Engine because there's not enough screen resolution to fit the whole level. So you've got a handful of levels that don't normally scroll vertically here because everything is just so big to fit on screen. It's not the first time we've seen this. Ordyne also had this problem, if you want to call it that somewhat. And it might be a common issue with other shooters of this ilk that aren't custom made for PC Engine, but it's a slight adjustment you have to make for this version of the game, and really doesn't matter in the long run, because you're only missing a bit of space on the very edges, which is usually just solid terrain anyway, while a couple of the early stages retain their verticality of sorts, something that is lost in the NES port at least. Honestly, that aspect makes the PC Engine version as close to near arcade perfection as you could have gotten back in the day, wherein other versions would make changes based on hardware limitations or other considerations. Here, other than a slight difference of screen height and a couple other things, the game feels nearly authentic. Hell, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the slowdown that occasionally hits the game is a flaw with the home port, and that could easily be the case. But to be fair, Arcade Gradius also had its share of slowdown when things got a bit heated. Still, there are times when such slowdown can be considered a hidden blessing of sorts, and besides, it's not like the game becomes horrifically unplayable by this point. Gradius controls fine, it's fairly responsive even during the heaviest of moments, and the gameplay as a whole is pretty tight, even if it is half a decade behind the times. You gotta remember that Gradius came out in 1985, and by 1991 the series was 3 games in, along with a number of spin-off titles, and they all boast features that this vanilla entry lacks. Now that doesn't make Gradius a bad game per se, merely an antiquated one, especially in light of what was on the other end of the 16-bit smorgasbord, so to speak. But enough about that. Those couple other things I mentioned a minute or so ago is in regards to the overall presentation of the game. Screen height aside, I noticed the graphics are slightly nicer in this version than the arcade, with some minor additional details added to some of the terrain and the enemies as well. The colors might not be as vibrant here, but not necessarily a deal breaker either. Again, in terms of recreating the overall visuals, this port nails it and then some. Likewise, Gradius sees an upgrade in audio. Most notably, the music naturally sees an upgrade from the comparatively anemic arcade melodies to the more enhanced and fleshed out compositions in this version. Even some of the sound effects have a punchier heft to them, so they don't sound like slightly higher quality Famicom sound effects as was the case in the arcade. Yep. Better late than never is something I would have said if I either lived in Japan or if this had seen release locally on TurboGrafx-16. Actually, realistically, around that time, I wouldn't have known nor cared, but that's doesn't matter right now. Gradius was done some semblance of justice on PC Engine. It looks the part, it more than sounds the part, most importantly, it plays the part quite nicely despite a couple hiccups. And while the extra level is a nice little bonus, the main draw is the closest you were getting to the arcade experience on a home console around that time. On that front, Gradius on PC Engine gets the job done, and while it's been surpassed by its many successors, it remains a fun little shooter thing that's worth revisiting every once in a while.